We are in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, in which for the first time, we are the dominant force of nature. We are rapidly shaping the planet on a geological scale. This means that we can now threaten the stability, integrity, and health of our human environment for us and for future generations. Climate change is but the most poignant example, but other new technologies, such as in synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, etc., now also raise important challenges both for us and for future generations. Concerns about future generations must now be central in what we do. At the same time, we have new governance challenges. The world today may be characterized as kaleidoscopic. Change takes place rapidly and often unexpectedly. There are many different actors. In addition to states, coalitions form and disband rapidly, and the bottom-up empowering of peoples competes with efforts at top-down control of peoples. Information and communications technology have let people communicate instantaneously all over the world and has extended, obviously, to many international organizations, national organizations, community organizations, as well as billions of people. In the kaleidoscopic world, it is more challenging to incorporate the interests of future generations across an increasingly broad range of issues. There is no voice for future generations in the decisions we take. Too often, the long-term costs are accrued for short-term benefits, which may only go to the few. We need institutions to give voice to the interest of future generations. The principle of intergenerational equity asserts that all generations are partners in caring for and using the earth, that we must pass our natural and cultural resources to future generations in at least as good condition as we receive them, so that future generations can meet their own needs. The proposed Global Pact for the Environment includes the principle of intergenerational equity and states, quote, present generations shall ensure that their decisions and actions do not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, unquote. We can identify three elements of justice to future generations. The first, comparable options, or one can think of it as a diversity, such as having available a diversity of energy resources. Secondly, comparable quality, such as avoiding long-term and irreversible contamination of lakes or oceans. And comparable or non-discriminatory access to benefit from the environment and its resources, including for vulnerable people and economically impoverished people. These elements encourage equality among generations. They do not require us to predict the values of future generations, which we cannot, but we give them the flexibility to pursue their own goals. And they are generally shared by and accepted by different cultural traditions and different economic and political systems, and can be reasonably made discrete. The report of the United Nations Secretary General in 2013 on intergenerational solidarity and the needs of future generations notes these three aspects of intergenerational equity. There is growing recognition of the need for considering future generations. The Oxford Martin Commission on the Future, chaired by Pascal Lamy, recognized that the failure to manage the world for future generations is serious and recommended ways to translate short-term choices into sustainable, long-term decision-making. Institutions that explicitly consider the interests of future generations date back about only 3 decades. Public sector institutions with such a mandate are still limited, though they have increased in number in the last 15 years. Some are attached to parliaments, others to the executive branches, and in some cases, the responsibilities have merged with efforts to ensure the important goal of sustainable development. France hosted one of the earliest institutions when in 1993, then President Mitterrand established the French Council on Future Generations, with Jacques-Yves Cousteau, known as GIC, as the council's president. The council focused primarily on nuclear issues. Many of the institutional initiatives on future generations are linked to parliaments. In 1991, Finland established the Committee for the Future as a permanent parliamentary committee to report on specific topics and analyze policies that affect the future. In 2001, Israel's parliamentary body, the Knesset, created a Commission on Future Generations with a commissioner for future generations with a broad mandate, but a focus in practice on children. The Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly has considered establishing a committee for the future within the Assembly. And I know that the next panel on this program addresses examples of the Ombudsperson in detail and committees for future generations. One very important proposal to give voice to future generations is through the establishment of an ombudsperson for future generations. The Office of Ombudsman was first established in Sweden to provide the parliament with a means to control the observance of law by judges, by civil servants, and by military officers. It evolved into an instrument for inspecting government agencies, prisons, investigating law enforcement, and it received several thousands of complaints from individuals each year. Ombudspersons now exist all over the world, and there is now precedent for an ombudsperson for future generations. An ombudsperson or an office of an ombudsperson can be given various functions. For example, it can ensure that the long-term effects of a given proposal, project, or policy, and the complex interactions that the interactions that the project proposal might trigger, that these are considered. It can ensure holistic assessment. It can help monitor and warn about long-term risks to help ensure informed decision-making and suggest ways to deal with these risks. It can serve as a watchdog to alert decision makers to otherwise unforeseen dangers and intervene in administrative or judicial cases in which the interests of future generations are either downplayed or ignored. Most importantly, it can send a signal to political leaders, to policymakers, and to the public, private sector, and civil society that we are responsible for our actions affecting future generations. The question must always be asked, what difference have such institutions made? On the positive side, they have brought issues affecting future generations, such as the effects of nuclear tests, contaminated soils, and natural resource damage, climate change, and the well-being of children. They brought them into consideration, and in some cases, have intervened in judicial litigation to do so. They have helped to create awareness of the long-term effects of policies and programs, and to ensure their consideration. On the less positive side, some of the institutions have lapsed or otherwise suffered, and there is always a danger that the institution can be captured by those with special interests who promote their own interests at the real expense of the well-being of future generations. One of the most significant effects may be that these institutions, and this is a positive one, provide models for the public sector at varying levels of government to create institutions that do consider and ensure consideration of future generations in their policies and actions. They may also be relevant to the private sector. The World Economic Forum has established a Global Futures Council, which is a multidisciplinary effort to develop a network of councils addressing specific aspects of the future. The focus today is on establishing an ombudsperson to give voice to future generations. Since almost any project or policy today may have long-term implications, it's always important to delineate the scope of the ombudsperson and the functions. In assessing the institution, we may want to pay attention to the following 6 criteria. 1, access. This has 2 elements. Does the ombudsperson have access to Parliament if it is established in association with Parliament? Do those with concerns about future generations have appropriate and effective access to the ombudsperson? Secondly, a criteria of competence and resources. Does the institution have the relevant competencies? And does it have the resources to substantiate its concerns about future generations through data gathering and analysis and research if needed, or resources to intervene appropriately? A third criterion, credibility. Does the institution maintain its impartiality and independence and avoid becoming an instrument of special interests? Does it have the trust of those who established it and of the public? Fourth, a criterion of efficiency. Resources are always limited. Does the institution operate efficiently with the resources that it does have. Fifth, effectiveness. Is the institution effective in identifying and ensuring the considerations of risks to future generations and impacts on future generations? And sixth, is the institution itself held responsible for its work? Future generations are increasingly strongly affected by what we do, but we have given them no voice. Political considerations often push for short-term considerations at the expense of considering long-term effects. Governments and the public sector have a critical role in ensuring that we give voice to future generations. We can no longer afford to ignore them. Thank you.